Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. This video is going to be very Xbox heavy with the news. Quite honestly, there's a lot of stuff happening in Xbox land, which isn't surprising, given, of course, we will soon have the Xbox conference in just under a week now. But there is something we will be starting out with which isn't Xbox related, and this is Intel's Alder, which of course is the 12th generation of CPUs from the company. And what is super interesting about this is that Tim Apisak has discovered a series of entries on the Sysoft Sandra database. Now, while what has been discovered doesn't exactly give us complete insight into the architecture of the CPU, and indeed something that's kind of interesting is that the actual CPU here is being listed as DDR4 for its client, when we're almost positive it's going to be DDR5. But what we can know is that the CPU itself has an iGPU which has 32 cores. Now, just to be abundantly clear, this is not 32 CPU cores. We are instead referring to the number of execution units which is present on the iGPU of the processor. So this equals 256 shading units. We're not actually 100% certain as to whether this is Generation 12 graphics or whether it's going to be Gen 11 graphics. Gen 11 is what we believe is part of Rocket Lake S, which is the 11th generation from the company, which is going to release, well, probably late this year / early next year. Of course, there have been a plethora of Alder Lake leaks over the past few weeks, not least of which is that it will be featuring Intel's hybrid technology, which is basically another way of saying an amalgamation of big / small cores. And of course it will also require a new platform as well, LGA 1700, and the CPU itself is going to be very interesting, I think, because I feel that it's going to definitely I would say dictate Intel's strategy over the next couple of years, well, at least when they launch, and how they will market themselves against AMD. After all, AMD themselves aren't exactly holding back on their own CPUs. Every single year, Intel have faced a new CPU from AMD. AMD are being relentless in terms of their execution, and Milan still looks like it's going to hit the data center by the end of this year. And from everything I'm hearing, Milan is not a slouch. It's a considerable step up. I actually went over some leaks from Jim over at Adore TV yesterday with Milan, and I've actually learned a few extra things myself, which I'll probably make a video on maybe tomorrow. But long story short, Zen 3 is going to be quite monstrous, and by the time Alder Lake hits, well, you can probably expect AMD to be replacing Ryzen 4000. So what I'm basically saying is that the next couple of years for Intel are going to be extremely interesting, but also for us as well as consumers. I feel that we're actually getting a lot of choice now, which is definitely a good thing for the end user. And one thing that perhaps could definitely benefit the data center, as well as potentially us as well, is the fact that TSMC will have a lot of its manufacturing capability freed up when Apple leaves the 7nm node. So theoretically, we could see AMD gobble that up. It's going to be curious. I suspect that they're probably going to need it anyway, given the plethora of products which are going to be released on the 7nm node, not least of which, of course, is the second generation of RDNA, which we also expect to launch by the end of the year too. I did warn you guys that there's tons of Xbox information, but honestly, some of this stuff is super duper 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 cool. Yes, there was a lot of dupers there. And one thing which we've learned actually is just how the team have tweaked and tucked Gears 5 for the Xbox Series X, and this is during an Unreal livestream that Coalition, who is of course the developers behind Gears 5 now, have actually provided some insight into what they've been doing with the Xbox Series X version of the game. Now, basically, you can think of this as the PC version with the Ultra settings, albeit with some tweaks and perhaps even further visual effects added, because obviously the team have had more time now to start working on it. So one thing that has been improved is high resolution textures, but we also see higher anisotropic filtering added, higher resolution volume fog, higher quality depth of field, which honestly, I'm not a major fan of depth of field or whatever, or motion blur, but I know that that's a thing for taste rather than, an actual technical thing. Extremely far draw distances with much higher level of detail on distant objects. Shadow resolution and shadow distances have also improved as well. Higher quality screen space reflections, and also we see improvements in the post-processing pipeline. That was a bit of a mouthful. So we now have better blur, lens flare, yay, lens flare, light shafts, and so on and so on. Apparently the team are also working on exclusive features for the Xbox Series X, and this does include screen space global illumination, and we will also see higher particle counts too. According to the team, when it comes to the screen space global illumination, or SSGI if you prefer, this is going to be integrated from UE 4.24. Obviously, UE5 is being worked on, but UE5 is not going to be for Gears 5. UE5 looks like it's going to launch by the end of next year, although the beta is going to be before that. So this is basically tweaks and enhancements based on the UE4 engine, albeit later. The higher particle count, well, according to the team, it's over 50% higher than the PC Ultra spec, which is fantastic. The cinematics as well, which are going to be playing in real time, are going to be running at 4K 60 FPS, which is double the frame rate compared to the Xbox One cinematics. And also, something I forgot to mention is that the contact shadows are also going to be way more realistic, as it's going to be on a per pixel trace, meaning that light sources are going to be way more accurate compared to what they were. Now, one thing that's a little interesting to me is that the multiplayer support for the Gears 5 Xbox Series X implementation is going to be 120 FPS, or at least that's what the team are aiming for. But if you recall what I said all of several minutes ago, the global illumination is going to be running at 4K 60 FPS with UE 4.24. So it seems like the team will need to cut back certain features when you are playing multiplayer if you are aiming for 120 FPS. I must admit, I'm super looking forward to seeing what the team have been working on with Halo as well as Gears. I think it's going to be really cool. I also wonder if we're going to get updated code for the PC version as well. After all, the PC can obviously rather easily handle that, assuming you've got a competent enough GPU, such as, let's say for the sake of argument, an RTX 2080 or above. You can very happily run the game at those settings. And given the next-gen PC cards are going to be out by the end of the year, to me it's going to be fascinating to see how those cards kind of square up against the next-gen consoles. Oh, also, something that I meant to cover yesterday, but honestly, it came up just as Amy was finishing editing, so I'm going to throw it in today, and that is that Microsoft are ending the production of both the Xbox One X and the Xbox One S, or digital. In a statement which was issued to The Verge, Microsoft said, and I quote, "As we ramp into the future with the Xbox Series X, we're taking the natural step of stopping production for the Xbox One X and Xbox One S, or digital edition. The One S will continue to be manufactured and sold globally, so gamers can check with their local retailers for more detail on Xbox One hardware availability." Let's just be honest, this is not exactly surprising to you. It's not exactly a revelation that Microsoft are ending the production of, let's say, the Xbox One X. I think it makes sense for these consoles to go EOL as they prepare for the new generation to kind of come in. It'll be interesting to me what happens in terms of the pricing of these systems, whether Microsoft are going to start reducing the price really heavily and doing major discounts or doing massive bundles or something else. And also what the prices of, let's say, Lockhart will be when they finally announce it. And I also wonder how many SKUs we're going to get of each console. For example, will Lockhart have an all-digital as well as a disc-based system? I kind of think that they will. The only issue I have with it is that it means there's going to be a damn lot of SKUs that Microsoft have on store shelves, which may not be a bad thing depending on how they market it. For example, they could have an all-digital Xbox Series X, an all-digital Xbox Lockhart, and then the disc version. Another thing that wouldn't honestly surprise me too much is if Microsoft did not have a disc version of Lockhart. I kind of feel that that might be a good strategy just to keep the price as simple and cheap as possible. The only thing with that is that not everyone, of course, has access to super fast internet. So for them not to include a disk drive in certain SKUs of Lockhart would essentially, for some people, negate the purpose of actually buying the machine. As if you've got, let's say for sake of argument, a 200 gigabyte bandwidth cap or you've got slow-ass internet, yeah, okay, you're still going to need to patch the game or whatever, but still. In fact, I know quite a few people who buy the disc version of the game don't actually update the software if they're on kind of tighter caps. So just like, okay, well, unless there's a really big, like, major update, such as, I don't know, that the game crashes or performance issues without updating it, they will just use the game with the base version, simply because they don't want to kind of spend that bandwidth. Or if they're on slower internet, they'll just let it kind of download maybe over a couple of nights or something like that, or if they're going to a friend's house or whatever. And a couple of final stories for the Xbox. I did tell you it's an Xbox every day. According to Phil Spencer, well, it's going to be really down to developers on next-gen exclusivity. So, as you are almost certainly aware at this point, Microsoft have, to a degree, pledged some level of cross-generation from the Xbox One to the Xbox series of consoles. And this has been met with, quite honestly, an awful lot of questions of whether this is going to hold back games or not. I've actually been speaking to yet more developers on this, and I may do a separate video, but I want to go over this specific thing, which is an interview with GameStar. According to Spencer, on the 23rd, they'll be providing their studios real creative freedom to build games that they've envisioned. As you know, they've added a lot of studios to the Xbox Game Studios organization and providing them the financial stability, the creative freedom to go build the games that they want to build. So I think when you hear Matt Booty, which is, by the way, the best last name ever, talking about what our creators will say is we have a vision for every game that we're building, and the vision starts with the player, not the device. If a creator comes to us and say, no, I really want to focus on the next generation of their games, we are open to that, and we're very supportive. But if a creator comes to us and say, I have this vision for reaching these customers across different platforms and different generations, they're also supportive of that. It's really down to our creators to have the choice and allowing them to build the games that they want to build the audience for. It's not our rules for our platform. It's more about creating games that they want to basically build. Now, honestly, it's going to be interesting to see how all of this is handled. I keep being asked whether I think that support for the Xbox One is going to be a problem. And I honestly have quite a lot to say on this topic, but as a Cliff Notes version here, I think it's really going to be dependent upon the game and how that game is being created. And also what resources the studio has. So, for example, it's going to certainly be a lot more work for the developers themselves, and possibly certain games will need to be changed in terms of the mechanics. Will it hold back the Series X is a very difficult thing to figure out, because it depends whether the Series X was the lead platform, and you also need to take into consideration that very frequently the first, let's say, wave of games which come out are actually kind of limited anyway as developers get to grips on the hardware. Personally speaking, I think that it's going to definitely be challenging on certain games. I haven't seen Halo running on the Xbox One X, but let's say for sake of argument that you have the two versions running. One thing they can do is half the frame rate. Have the game running at 30 FPS. They can reduce animation quality for further distant objects. They can also have way more loading screens and this type of stuff. But potentially too, there will be reduction in physics quality and so on for the Xbox One console. Not to mention the fact that certain things just would be impossible to run on the Xbox One anyway. For example, any mechanics which would benefit or use ray tracing or bounce lighting or anything like that. So let's say light-based puzzles, or let's say a horror game where you need to, I don't know, see behind you in mirrors or whatever. I'm just creating stuff in my head. And yes, you can do some of this stuff with like screen space reflections and other methods, but ultimately, it's going to be very interesting to see what Microsoft actually do for this, because it's going to be a lot harder for developers, I think, to kind of fully use both generations. But then again, both developers creating cross-generation games is nothing new. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think we'll know a lot more by the 23rd, which is kind of when I want to revisit this topic again. Hopefully we get to see some gameplay of both the Xbox One and Xbox Series X implementations of titles. That would probably give us a lot more insight into how Microsoft, at least internally, are handling this. And you also need to remember that Microsoft Studios are way bigger than, in that they can actually afford to buffer this and have the extra artists and have the extra programmers to, I guess you could say, tweak the games. And I suspect that certain games will probably come out maybe in a couple of years on both the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, which definitely would be not possible to do on this generation. Like Spider-Man, for example, on the PS5, obviously we're seeing very limited gameplay, but ultimately it is using a variant of the same engine, which is for the PS4, so I'm sure if they scale back the visuals and perhaps reduce the quality of some of the models and done this other stuff, it would work on the PS4. But obviously that's not what Sony are doing. I say that, however, with a lot of ignorance to the full scope and city of Spider-Man on the PS5, so maybe that is kind of a bad example. However, something like Ratchet and Clank, could it work on the PS4? Yes, if major changes were made in how it functions because of how the sheer amount of data that's being loaded. So I think certain games, as we're seeing, are going to be exclusive on the Xbox Series X, as that's what some developers want to do. So I'm going to be very curious to see how this shakes up for the next gen. Also, something I got told by a source, and honestly, I don't know how accurate this information is, so I'm just throwing it into the end of this video. But one thing I'm hearing about the Xbox event is that potentially Microsoft are going to be announcing that Xbox is going to be the flagship again for Call of Duty. I'm way less confident about this information than a lot of the stuff we've reported, especially of the PlayStation 5. As regular viewers will know, I've reported quite a lot of stuff about the PS5, which I'm way more confident in than this. But apparently that's going to be one of the mic drops. That would be interesting because, to my knowledge anyway, most of the focus of the July 23rd event is of course going to be Microsoft's first-party studios, but perhaps it could be the August event that the Call of Duty thing is announced. However, I just want to stress, take that with a massive grain of salt. I'm not going to report that as a definite by any stretch of the imagination. So go into that with a, well, if it turns out that source was right, but I have some skepticism. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. The normal stuff if you did. Like, share, comment and subscribe. And I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.